For nearly a century, Israelis and Palestinians have been at each other's throats, each vying for the same tiny patch of land. But this isn't just a battle over borders or resources, it's a battle over history itself. And few places are as saturated with history as the ancient city of Hebron, or in Arabic, Al-Khalil. The city's name means friend or unity in both Hebrew and Arabic. It's an ironic name for a segregated city riven by bloodshed. This is where two stories collide, where the most fervent believers have staked their claim, where faith animates every step, every breath, every decision, often with deadly consequences for both Israelis and Palestinians. Is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict actually a war of religion? Let's be clear, I'm not suggesting that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has only one root cause. Very few things in life are that cut and dry. But it's no coincidence that holy sites have been at the center of some of the bloodiest chapters of Israeli and Palestinian history. Among the many tragic ironies of this conflict is the fact that both sides share significant DNA, tracing their origin to a man that Jews know as Avraham Avinu, and Muslims call Ibrahim Khalilullah. Hebron's sacred history begins with him. The Hebrew Bible refers to Hebron by name 87 times, but it's the second of these references that is most significant, because it's one of the oldest land deeds in recorded history. In front of a crowd of witnesses, Abraham pays 400 silver shekels in exchange for the plot of land behind me, where he can bury his wife Sarah. 2 chapters after this exchange, he joins her here. Eventually, the rest of their family would be buried here too. Unsurprisingly, this tomb is among the holiest sites of the Abrahamic religions. This is where the father of 3 faiths has laid for centuries, silent and still as the world raged around him. For centuries, the tomb was little more than a cave, until the Jewish king Herod built an elaborate structure atop it, with its roof open to the sky. That structure is what stands right behind me, though its function has changed over time. Humans have a curious tendency to build holy sites on top of one another. When Christianity became the dominant religion of the region, the Byzantines converted a part of the tomb into a church, though they allowed Jews to continue to worship there. The same thing happened after the Arab conquest. Like the Byzantines before them, they converted the existing structure into their own house of worship. It's a proclamation. My history, my story, is the most valid of all.
This region thinks historically. This region thinks religiously. Okay? It's important to people. Who was Abraham? It's important to them that they're related to Abraham. It's important to them that they administer the tomb of Abraham. In Jerusalem, the question is, who does God favor? Whose God reigns supreme in Jerusalem? Muslim God or the Jewish God? And here it's, who's the chosen son of Abraham?
But since his passing, Abraham has been silent on that question, leaving each successive leader of Hebron to impose his own answer. And so, ownership of Hebron passed from Jews to Christians to Muslims to Muslims again, each change upending the balance of power in the sacred city. But despite periods of persecution, local rulers had always allowed Jews to worship at their ancient site. And then, the Mamluks came along and prohibited any non-Muslims from entering the tomb at all.
The last 700 years, we were not allowed in our own building. The Tomb of the Patriarchs and Matriarchs is a Herodian structure built by a Jewish king on top of Jewish tombs. We were not allowed under Islam to go into that building for 700 years.
Most of those 700 years were fairly uneventful for the Jews of Hebron, who continued to live among their Muslim neighbors despite their second-class status. Overall, the city's Jewish community remained small, poor, and pious. And then, World War I ripped the whole world apart, upsetting a centuries-long status quo. The Ottoman Empire was gone, its land divided between the British and the French. The British, who took over Palestine, weren't supposed to be there long. They'd made all sorts of vague and ambiguous promises to both the Arabs and the Jews of Palestine, but both groups were growing uneasy. During World War I, the British had discussed the possibility of a self-governing Arab state, but the possibility was just that, an option among many that never turned into more. 2 years later, the Brits really ticked off the Arab world by promising the Jews a national home in Palestine. Palestine's Arabs watched with alarm as Jewish immigrants poured into the region, buying up land and building new towns. Despite all this upheaval, Hebron remained quiet throughout the 1920s. Well, sort of. Tzipi Schliessel has deep roots in Hebron, and she explained to me that the city's Arab-Jewish coexistence was a lot more complicated than it seemed.
היה מיתוס שהיו יחסים טובים. בתוך כל זה, כשנכנסים לרזולוציה יותר מדויקת, היה כל הזמן טאקלים.
For centuries, Jews were minorities in their own homeland, subject to the whims of their neighbors and local leaders. Like their brothers across the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe, they had very little protection from persecution. All that changed with the birth of political Zionism. The movement galvanized Jews all over the world, reminding them that their fate was in their own hands, that their protection would never come from anyone but themselves. And that meant they needed a Jewish state, a Jewish army to defend the rights they had been denied for so long, including the right to worship freely at their ancient sacred sites. The Jews of 1920s Hebron weren't political Zionists. Unlike most Zionist leaders, they were deeply pious. To them, protection came from God, not a government or army. So until the Messiah arrived, they'd make the best of their circumstances. But fate had other plans. By the end of the decade, Hebron's ancient Jewish community would be gone. The survivors and their descendants would change their mind about the power of Zionism. But as pious people, their Zionism would take on a religious bent, one that grew stronger with every massacre and war and injustice. This messy tangle of religious and political conviction had echoes on the Muslim side as well. A young hothead named Hajj Amin al-Husseini was the first major figure in this conflict to braid together faith and nationalist violence. There was no contradiction or separation between his religious belief and his determination to cleanse Palestine of Jews. Husseini came from a long line of religious and civil leaders, including 13 of Jerusalem's mayors. The Husseinis had been firmly opposed to Zionism from the start, and Hajj Amin had even briefly fled Jerusalem before the British could arrest him for inciting violence against Jews. But the Husseinis were important and influential, and the British understood that if they wanted to keep the peace, they need to stay on the good side of Palestine's Arab elites. So even though they knew Hajj Amin was an instigator, the British decided that the best way to diffuse the rising tensions was to give him more power? Yeah, it doesn't make sense to me either, but hindsight is 20/20. So the British High Commissioner dropped the charges against him and made up a fancy title for Hajj Amin, Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Muftis are Muslim religious leaders, and the position has been around for nearly as long as Islam itself. But the title of Grand Mufti was a British invention, just like the Supreme Muslim Council that the Grand Mufti now controlled. Husseini's title may have been made up, but he was now the most powerful non-British person in all of Palestine, with both religious and civil authority. He used that authority to incite a religious war.
In 1928, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, the leader of Palestinian Muslims under British rule, began to spread a rumor that has remained as strong as it was then as it is today. That rumor was that the Jews of Palestine were plotting to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque to rebuild the ancient Jewish temple.
Al-Aqsa, aka the Temple Mount, isn't in Hebron, it's in Jerusalem. Two Jewish holy temples once stood there. The famous Western Wall is the wall that once encircled the western end of the temple complex. For centuries, it was the closest we could get to our holiest site. But the site is holy to Muslims too. According to Islamic tradition, Muhammad made a miraculous journey from Mecca to Jerusalem on the back of a winged horse-like creature. From the Temple Mount complex, Muhammad ascended to heaven. So when Muslim armies conquered Jerusalem, the Caliph built a beautiful domed shrine directly on top of this holy site, acknowledging the innate holiness of the site and signaling that whatever its history, the Temple Mount was now unquestionably Muslim. He likely had no idea that this decision would lead to a century of bloodshed. By the time Hajj Amin became Grand Mufti, tensions between Jews and Arabs were sky high. Any change to the old status quo could set Palestine on fire. But Hajj Amin introduced a spiritual dimension to the conflict, with the Temple Mount complex as the front lines. Under his rule, holy sites were no longer just sacred spaces. They were now symbols of both sides' nationalist aspirations, litmus tests for who had the rightful claim to Palestine. But more than that, they were symbols of whose history was more valid, whose story was most correct. So Hajj Amin al-Husseini launched a series of renovations directly on top of the wall. Jews had to duck falling bricks as they prayed below. Meanwhile, the Muslim call to prayer increased in volume. Young Arab men threw stones at Jewish worshippers. To be sure, some Jews were calling for exclusive Jewish control of the wall, but most Jews and many Arabs were wary of upsetting the status quo. Sure, the holy sites were important to everyone, but not everyone wanted to fight for them, unless they felt provoked by the other side. Extremism breeds extremism, and Hajj Amin al-Husseini was ready to escalate. Every summer, Jews observed the somber fast of Tisha B'Av, commemorating the day the first and second temples were destroyed. In 1929, Preparations for the fast included a procession of some 6,000 Jews in Tel Aviv shouting, "The wall is ours." Hundreds more Jews rallied at the wall, some with batons. No one was hurt, but the message was loud and clear. We were here first and we're not afraid of you. But they should have been. Haj Amin had been preparing for a moment like this. He already had the pamphlets printed, claiming that the Jews were not only planning to take over the wall, but had already violated the honor of Islam. And soon, a mob of angry young Muslims rampaged in front of the Western Wall. Young Jews formed volunteer security squads to protect the worshippers. But it was too late. The entire country burned. Arab rioters vandalized shops, beat up pedestrians, and looted homes. But just a few miles away in Hebron, the Jewish community wasn't worried at all.
When the Haganah visited Hebron and offered protection or evacuation from Hebron for the Jews, they were told to leave immediately by the Jewish leaders of Hebron because they said, our Arab friends are our neighbors, they will never hurt us.
They were wrong. The riots did come to Hebron, but by then, it was no longer a riot. It was a massacre.
Women, teenage girls were in front of their families before they were killed. Parents were butchered by their neighbors in front of the eyes of their children. Babies were slaughtered in their mother's arms. Some people were burned to death. And the Jewish community of Hebron, one of the world's most ancient Jewish communities that had existed there for thousands of years, was decimated and evacuated by the British authorities who ruled Palestine at the time. And they were told never to return.
So the massacre didn't just decimate an ancient community. It also destroyed any semblance of trust or hope of coexistence. Many of the non-Zionist Jews of Hebron, who had so deeply trusted their neighbors, became Zionists. If centuries of semi-peaceful coexistence hadn't protected them, nothing would. Nothing except God and a strong Jewish state. The fledgling self-defense teams that had protected the Jews of Palestine began to take their job much more seriously. Over the next 2 decades, those defense squads would unite, morphing into the strongest military force in the Middle East. For the next century, they and their descendants would watch the same story play out again and again. 19 years after the Hebron massacre, Israel declared independence. The next day, 5 Arab armies invaded. After a year of war, the Jewish state emerged, scarred and diminished, but alive. Jordan had conquered the Temple Mount and the West Bank. They barred all Jews from their holy places. Not Israelis, Jews. For nearly 2 decades, Hebron, like the rest of the West Bank, was empty of Jews and full of Arab refugees. And then came the 6-Day War. In under a week, Israel wrested control of East Jerusalem and the West Bank from Jordan, as well as the Sinai and Gaza from Egypt and the Golan Heights from Syria. And after 40 years, Hebron's Jews began to return home.
And it was only natural that after we liberated the city, that we would come back here first. There was just a tremendous pull back to our properties and also back to being close to the forefathers and mothers.
That proximity to history and sacred spaces attracts a certain kind of person. One who cares very, very deeply about the past and who puts themselves on the front lines to ensure it doesn't repeat. You might call such a person an extremist, and they might wear that label proudly.
Who makes it to the top units, the elite units in the army? Who makes it there? People who are extreme. And the people that live here are just like that. They are a certain kind of elite. They are extremely dedicated. They are extremely dedicated to Jewish history, to the Bible, to Jewish rights, and they recognize, they have a sense of the fight that has always existed, and they now have the ability to push back against our abusers. They have been schooled in Jewish history and in Jewish thought, and have a keen sense of our rights. And yes, there's some tough folks around here. That's what you got to be in the Middle East.
At first, the Israeli government had no intention of allowing Jews back in Hebron. It was a major Arab population center, holy to 3 religions. In fact, the Israeli government initially placed restrictions on Jewish worshippers at the Tomb of the Patriarchs, wary of upsetting the local Arab population. But eventually, enough Jews had moved to Hebron and the government relaxed its restrictions. The truth was, no one was sure what would happen to the West Bank after the war. Some people favored returning it unilaterally. Others urged the government to hang on to strategic portions that were essential for either security or national identity. Even David Ben-Gurion, an avowed secularist who had called for a return of most of the conquered lands, believed that Hebron should remain under Israeli control, That's how important the city is, not just to the religious, but to the Israeli character and Jewish story as a whole. But the more sacred a place, the more likely it is to be a flashpoint, and life in Hebron remained tense through the 80s and 90s. In 1993, Israeli and Palestinian leaders acknowledged one another's legitimacy for the first time, signing an agreement that was meant to lead to peace. Peace never materialized. Instead, the agreements were met with a rash of terror and the growth of settlements. Behind closed doors, the chairman of the PLO encouraged jihad, even as he smiled and shook hands with the Israelis. As buses and cafes exploded around them, as the violence spiraled, many Israelis and Palestinians grew disillusioned. And the tens of thousands of Israelis living in the West Bank were especially worried. Would their government uproot them from their homes to make way for a Palestinian state? And if it did, would they get peace and quiet, or more attacks? But one of the most shocking attacks didn't come from Hamas or Islamic Jihad. It came from a Jew. Jewish terrorists had begun targeting Arabs in the West Bank in the summer of 1980, alarmed by Israel's recent peace deal with Egypt and enraged that the Israeli government had uprooted Jewish settlements in the Sinai to make it happen. Baruch Goldstein did not start out as a member of this underground, though his religious devotion had long since curdled into an apocalyptic vision of Jews as holy warriors, liberating themselves by the sword. But in his day-to-day life, he was a physician serving the Jews of Kiryat Arba. On February 25, 1994, Goldstein rose early that morning. Before dawn, he immersed himself in a ritual bath, then headed to the tomb where his ancestors lay. That year, the Jewish holiday of Purim coincided with the Muslim holiday of Ramadan, and the mosque above the tomb was crowded with worshippers for the dawn prayer. And then, Baruch Goldstein raised his automatic rifle and unleashed round after round into a crowd of 800 Muslims as they bent in prayer.
The steady scream of ambulance sirens pierced the Israeli morning as body after body was removed from the Ibrahim Mosque. It was just after dawn when the attack came. The worshippers were kneeling in prayer. Suddenly, Dr. Baruch Goldstein, a Jewish settler from New York City, slipped in, blocked the only exit, and opened fire.
It was a bloodbath. 29 Palestinians gone. The shots only stopped when the crowd beat Goldstein to death. Violence erupted throughout the West Bank as Palestinians protested the massacre. And yet, somehow, the peace talks limped along. 3 years later, Israel and the PLO signed an agreement that remains in effect to this day. The PLO would control 80% of Hebron, an area now known as H1. The IDF would control the 20% of the city and its outskirts that houses the tomb, as well as thousands of Jews and tens of thousands of Palestinians. For 3 decades, the Palestinians of H2 have suffered harsh restrictions on their basic freedoms, in part because of the violence that erupted after Goldstein's massacre. The Israeli government and the Jewish community of Hebron say these restrictions are a response to the constant threat of terror. And terrorism is an issue in Hebron, as Tzipi knows all too well.
ואבא בעצם נהרג בבית שלו, נרצח לעיניה של אימא. איך אני אשאר עכשיו בבית שזה מה שאני ראיתי מול העיניים? מה אני אעשה עכשיו? ומה מצד שני, אם אני אעזוב את חברון, אז זה ייתן מוטיבציה לעוד מחבלים להרוג יהודים.
Many Palestinians say that these security restrictions are merely an excuse for a land grab, a way to make Palestinians so miserable that they'll just pack up and leave.
For us, we need the protections. Not the way around. They have armed, they have a soldier to protect them. Our people, they need protect. Not from the soldiers, from the settlers.
Right.
I have a car, I have yellow plate. I cannot driving here. Because if they found I'm a Palestinian, then there will be a problem.
And you have a blue ID and...
Exactly, I have an Israeli resident. I can't come with my car into here because I'm an Arab. Like you talk about more than 35,000 Palestinians living in that side. You know what I mean? They can't moving with a car, somewhere else. They have to carry everything from their home, to the old side, to buying, shopping and everything. And this is every day, 8 o'clock in the evening, it will be shut down. You know what I mean?
They cannot drive their cars.
No.
Period.
No, they're not.
Hebron's Palestinians painted a dire picture of harassment by Jews, of a strangled economy, of a constant choking sensation from all the restrictions on movement.
أنا عايشة هون يعني صعب وأصعب من الصعب. كتير تعرضنا لأشياء هون عن حاجز، أولادي جوزي ولادي اعتقلوهم، ظلم، قعدوا 20 يوم ممنوع في داري هي بيتي وهي تبع الحاجز، ممنوع يصلوا الحاجز هذا يطلع منه، ممنوع يصلوا الحرم، كل يوم بصير مشاكل معي على الحاجز.
Strangely, the Jews of Hebron report a similar feeling. Even though the army is there to protect them, they know that their presence in Hebron relies on a well-funded, heavily armed military force that cordons off certain areas for their almost exclusive use, while keeping them out of the majority of Hebron. They are well aware that without this military protection, without these restrictions on their neighbors, there would be no Jewish community in Hebron at all. And they believe, fully, that such restrictions are necessary.
The army understood that there's a great tension here, and they basically made a sterile zone where the Jewish ghetto existed, is now once again a kind of sterile Jewish ghetto, but that allows our community to live here unmolested and unharmed. Sadly, the jihadism is all around us. The hate for Israel is all around us. I pick up Arab textbooks that kids throw on the floor. And I don't read and write Arabic, but I have Google Lens and now AI. I translate these things. You cannot believe the hate that's baked in to the Palestinian education. 2 + 2 = 4 dead Jews. That's math.
המחבל שרצח את אבא שלי בחסות הסכם חברון, אז הוא ברח כמה מטרים לרשות הפלסטינית ולא תפסו אותו. אז הוא עשה אחר כך עוד פיגוע וברח, ואחר כך עוד פיגוע בבאר שבע ושם תפסו אותו. השופט נתן לו 3 מאסרי עולם. הוא אמר שמישהו שזה לא אנושי לנסות שוב ושוב להרוג יהודים. ואז הוא קם ואמר לשופט, למה אתה אומר שאני לא אנושי? אני בן אדם טוב, אני עבדתי אצל יהודים, הם סמכו עליי, הם נתנו לי את המפתחות של הבית, והוא תיאר שהוא שמע דרשה על הר הבית, והוא החליט שהוא הולך להרוג יהודים. וזה מה שקרה בפרעות תרפ"ט. הערבים פה שחיו יחד, שמעו את הדרשות הסתה, בטיעונים דתיים, והם קמו ורצחו את היהודים.
In Hebron, history saturates every step, every building, every interaction. There is no past here. There is no was. It feels as though Abraham just handed over his 400 shekels. It's as though the axes of 1929 are still cleaving bodies apart. The bullets of 1994 still firing into the crowd. It's like stepping into the most concentrated form of this conflict. Fervent, bitter, and inescapable. Most Israelis and Palestinians seem unable to accept the other's narrative, the other's truth.
Yeah, it happened, the massacres, but it happened not against Jews. No one Jewish family had been hurt in that time. They've been living in Hebron and they've been born in Hebron. No one of them had been hurt. Only the Jews arrived here with another ideology and tried to do this. This is what happened to them.
This might be what Abu Hassan believes, but native-born Arabic-speaking Jews were the first to be killed. And as we've said, Hebron's community wasn't Zionist. It didn't matter if they were Sephardic or Ashkenazi, if their families had lived in Hebron for centuries, or if they were recent arrivals to the yeshiva. And it didn't matter what they believed. The mob didn't ask if someone was a Zionist before they cut him down. But that's an inconvenient narrative. It's much easier to believe that the massacre of 1929 happened for a reason beyond blind religious extremism. On the other side, some Jews genuinely believed that Baruch Goldstein had prior knowledge of an upcoming massacre.
He gave up his life, his wife, his children, because he knew what was going to happen that day in the Marat HaMachpelah.
They claimed that he was protecting the Jews of Hebron, even if he chose to do it in a way most Jews condemn. But there is absolutely zero evidence for this belief. It's a convenient story, not a true one. There are some who treat Goldstein as a hero, even visiting his grave on pilgrimage.
The most upsetting part of this whole thing isn't that the Arabs were killed. It was that Dr. Baruch Goldstein was killed.
He did something that had to be done just to show the world, to show the Jewish people that we're not going to tolerate this government.
I wish I had the guts to do it too.
These are the same people who believe the convenient narratives. They say Goldstein was a saint, a physician who treated everyone with gentleness.
A woman shouted,
Baruch HaTzedek!
Baruch HaTzedek. It was spoken with a thick American accent and it meant Baruch, the saint.
But as early as his IDF service, Goldstein was already refusing to treat non-Jews, including the Druze soldiers who served at his side. They make excuses, saying Goldstein snapped after his best friend died in his arms. Sadly, many Israelis and Palestinians have had loved ones die in front of their eyes, and they don't go on to massacre innocent people. People believe the stories that fit their narratives, that confirm that they are right. But the narratives that dominate the city are both riddled with inconsistencies and inconvenient half-truths. So are the people of Hebron doomed? Is there a way out that allows both people to live in dignity, without fear, without anger, in the land of their ancestors?
We have to come into a way that is our home both.
Right.
Either we live together or we can die together. You know, I mean, no other way.
Could the ancestors who lie silent, underground, provide a way out?
Muslims believe that Abraham, he is the prophet of the whole, or the father of the whole prophets. They believe he's the father of everyone. And don't forget that too, as what is proved more to you, that Abraham has two sons, have Ishaq and Ismail. And it means Jewish and Muslim are cousins, right?
Right.
And we are from the same place.
Now, one of the ways that I get over the tensions between Arabs and Jews is I say, look, we have a joint father here. We have a shared father. We have something that we can actually agree on and share and love.
I walked the ancient streets of Hebron accompanied by Israelis and Palestinians, each eager to tell their story. But another invisible presence trailed behind us, the specter of all the Jews and Arabs who died here at each other's hands. The people of Hebron have grown up haunted, not by the biblical figures that make this place holy, but by the wails of their murdered families and friends. And when you live in the shadow of your martyrs, you become pretty uncompromising, both in your vision of the past and your hopes for the future. But maybe there's another way, one that honors history while looking to the future. It's not a coincidence that the groundbreaking deal that normalized Israel's relationship with some Gulf states is known as the Abraham Accords. The man who set us on this collision course could also be the man to set us free. We are all Abraham's children. We are all equally valid, important, and beloved. And as long as we recognize that in one another, there is hope for Hebron and for the entire region.